Welcome back to my office. This is Pastor Bob Douglas, and I'm here to tell you a story. It's a story about my growing up. My grandfather was Arthur Wygant. My grandmother was Arthur and Elva Wygant. And he loved us so deeply. And he saw in me a curiosity of why things worked the way they did. And he fed that. He wanted to encourage me and learn how these machines worked. When I was about 12 years old, he gave me a set of tools. These are 4 wrenches that he gave me. If you look at them, even today, you can see that he took his little center punch and he chiseled in a little B on the back of those tools. And I've kept them all these years, used them all these years, because he wanted to make sure that I could keep my tools, that I could work on things in his shop. It was an amazing business. It was like a toy ground, a playground for a boy to learn anything and everything. And it was completely filled with all kinds of small engines. Engines that were 2 cycles, that were 4 cycles. I know you don't need to know all the differences about that. And I would sit there and take them apart and watch how the pieces moved back and forth inside that engine to see how it worked. And the 2 guys that were the main mechanics, Keith Walker and Don Iar, were really good at teaching me how this engine worked and what it took to make that mechanical thing begin to turn and run on its own, take the gasoline and the air mixture in, explode it with a spark plug, and get work done with that little engine. And I just enjoyed learning, and I became a full lawnmower mechanic, a small engine mechanic, and then I went on from there, became a machinist mate in the Navy, and finally got to the point where I was helping keep an aircraft carrier named USS Lexington working as a machinist mate down in the hold of that great big warship. USS Lexington is now a museum in Corpus Christi, Texas. And if you had some curiosity about it, I'll meet you in Corpus Christi and I'll take you around and show you what we did to make the machine work. I love figuring out why things work. I took a lot of science and physics classes to find out why the chemicals went together and had the responses and the reactions that they do. I watched the physics to see what the forces were and how they operated and how they made things happen. I was a senior in high school and I made a seismograph so that I could measure the rumbling of the earth, and I could see the movement of the shuddering of the earth, even in the basement of my house as a truck would go by on the street out front. You could get a little response to that from my seismograph. I love to find out what works. And if you jump forward about 15 years, they called me and they said, "Pastor Bob, we have a problem we'd like to have your help with. We have these boys, high school boys, who are probably not ever going to graduate from high school. They just were not good high school students. Several of them couldn't read. I think dyslexia was one of the problems that they faced for some of them. Others just had never learned how to read or how to understand, comprehend. There were about 12 boys in each of the classes, had 2 classes, 2.5 hours each. And they said they have come back into school to learn how to repair machines like small engines. Would you come and take these 12 boys in each of the classes and teach them how to make the engines work so that they can have a profession that they can learn and can use it to support themselves. And I said, certainly, glad to. And I came and worked as a school teacher in the Averill Career Center in Saginaw, Michigan for one school year, and we taught young men how to repair small engines. I couldn't give them a repair manual and say, here, read this and figure it out, but it had a very simple way of doing it. The engines were all operational. You could turn them on, you could pull the strings, you could operate them, they'd run. And then I would have the young men take one little section apart very carefully and begin to understand what made that particular part of the engine work. And then they had to put it back together and put it back on the engine stand and run it again. They had to see that they could make it work after working on it and taking part of it apart. And then we'd take another part, and then we'd... And every day we did something different with that engine all the way through the school year. And by the time they got done, all those young men were able to find jobs in repair shops around through the area that they could go in and immediately begin to repair the engines that needed to have things fixed in order to operate. I love discovering what make things work. Now fast forward a few more years and I'm called into the ministry, and a very good friend was teaching. His name was Hilliard Camp, and Hilliard Camp was a fantastic Bible scholar, a tremendous Bible scholar. And he said, I want to teach my students how things work. And of course, that was just exactly what I was interested in. So he began to teach a course on the Gospel of John. And the question was, why does it look the way it does? Now, there are two ways of doing a Bible study. The first way is to look at all the commentaries and all the experts down through the years that seem to know an awful lot about the words and the traditions and all the other kinds of things that are involved, and just learn about the book. But Hilliard Camp said, let's just read the book. Kind of a novel idea. And understand what it says. And it will teach us what it is. And it will teach us who wrote it. And it will teach us who Jesus was in a new and special way. Because if you're just reading what someone said 100 years ago or 50 years ago, when I was going to school, if you read those books, it would tell you that the Gospel of John was the last book in the New Testament that was written, and it was written maybe 250 years after Jesus was crucified. Well, if you say, well, how did a book get written that was so long after Jesus? How did that work? Well, they said it has some themes in it that didn't appear in the first century. He had to wait for about 3 centuries before the themes that the church was worried about would be addressed by this account. Well, that seemed to me like a very strange series of assumptions that they were making about the book. So Hilliard Camp said, let's just read the book, and then we'll figure out who wrote it, what it says, and we can come to our own sense of amazement at how God put this special treasure directly into our hands. Okay, so I want to just share, that's the kind of a Bible study I'd like to share with you, to see how it works. So let's see if we can find the spark plug that makes the Gospel of John work. Okay? The Gospel of John is unique. It doesn't look like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's very unique, very special. But it does have a driving purpose. Do you understand a driving purpose? A driving purpose is the very reason, the very core of what he's trying to accomplish. And so maybe we can pick up a couple of verses here and we'll be able to learn a little bit about the Gospel of John and why it looks the way it does. Okay? The first one I'm going to look at is John, the first chapter, verse 14. And here's what he writes. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. That's talking about Jesus coming to earth to live and be our example of what God is all about, and to show us what he wants us to do to live for him and to become our sacrifice for all times and our guarantee of a resurrection. All of those things. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Here's the key words. We have seen his glory. It was the glory of the one and only Son who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, does that sound like a driving purpose? It is for John, because John uses two words very, very frequently. Testimony and witness. Testimony and witness. What does it take to be a witness in a criminal trial? Can you be in the next county when something happens and come back and testify in a trial about who did what to whom? No. You have to be on site. You have to be in that location. You have to see, touch, feel, hear, participate in the event if you want to have a testimony that's believed. We have seen his glory. It was an awesome glory. It was the glory of the one and only Son of God. Okay. I saw it. I heard it. Let me go one more. Let's go to John 20, and we're going to go verse 31. Verse 31 says it this way. John writing now. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and by believing you may have life in his name. Now there's the spark plug that is setting off the explosion and making the machine move. That's the reason why he's writing the book, so that you can see what happened and you can come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that by believing you can have life in his name. Now that's exciting, because there aren't any other witnesses around anymore who can testify to what they actually saw and heard and experienced. So let's just take another example. This is John 19. John 19, 35. All right. And here it is. Talking about himself. All right. Let me step back just a couple verses. When they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, that's on Good Friday, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. Now, that's kind of a gruesome story, but it was the story of Jesus' crucifixion. But the next verse is very important. The man who saw it has given testimony, and his testimony is true. He knows that he tells the truth, and he testifies so that you may believe. Now, stop and think for a second. This man who saw it has given testimony. He stood at the foot of the cross and saw what the soldiers did. He saw what was being said while they were going about their work. They heard the discussion that Jesus had already died. They wanted to send back word that it was true that he actually had died. So one of the soldiers, in order to guarantee the fact that it was a complete and total non-question he was dead, took a spear and pierced his body, and pierced all the way through his lungs and up in through his heart. And out of that hole in the side of his body flowed blood and water. Now, is that just a theory? That there was blood and water pour out of the side of Jesus' body? Is it hearsay? Is it a made-up fairy tale? Is it a speculation? It's very popular right now to have conspiracy theories. Conspiracy theories, well, it only looked like he was punctured up through the side of his body. Maybe it was a trick. Well, he closes off the event by saying, the man who saw it gives this testimony. And his testimony is true. He knows what he tells is the truth. And he testifies so that you may believe. You see, that's the spark plug that makes John work. John wants to be the faithful witness to what he saw and did. I got one more for you. I'm going to turn back here to John 21. All right, Jesus is talking to Peter. Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Peter, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know I love you. Why do you say this? Finally, here are the words in verse 24 of John 21. This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. This is not, I dictated this to somebody else who wrote them down. He may have written them down incorrectly. I saw them. I heard them. I testified to these things, and I wrote them down. We know that this testimony is true. What does it mean for us 2,000 years after the event to look at a book who says right in the text of the book, in 3 different ways, in 4 different places, I saw it, I heard it, I wrote it down, I testify to this. It is the truth. Do you believe that's true? Do you believe that this book, this writer, wrote down what he saw, what he heard, and only what he saw and what he heard? personally saw and what he heard, or don't you? I mean, if this book was written, as some of the experts were trying to tell me when I was back in seminary, if this was written 250 years after Jesus, nobody lived that long. And what they used to tell me in the commentaries and the experts on these books would say, well, John had a bunch of faithful followers, and so when they wrote this book, they used his name, but they lied and said that he wrote it himself, but they were really only writing it on behalf of him. Let that sink in for a minute. Even if John had some very good friends who wanted to write a book about Jesus, and they lied on 4 different ways about saying we actually saw it and heard it and wrote it down ourselves, what can I believe about the rest of the book? Is there anything else that you can read in the story that you can believe? Well, it comes down, no, you can't believe John at all. There are a lot of people who will look at the Bible and say, I'll believe everything except the Gospel of John, because it was written so much later, and it was written at such a different time, and John never really wrote it down. It wasn't contemporary in the time of Jesus. It makes John worthless as a testimony. And all the way through the book, all of the testimonies from John the Baptist that testifies, that Moses who testifies, that Abraham who testifies, all of these people in the story of the Gospel of John who are bringing testimony, bringing witness to who Jesus is, means nothing, because it doesn't make it true. They just wrote it down to hope that we would believe they were saying the truth. Ah! But, if there was a man who was absolutely dumbstruck by what he saw and what he heard, he was profoundly impressed by what Jesus performed and what he accomplished. And he was so moved that he wrote this down during his life. I'm going to even assume pretty quickly after Jesus had gone back into heaven, to say, I want to make sure that my eyewitness account is clear, it's perfect, it's written down word for word as it happened. Then, then I have an account that I can believe. He was an eyewitness. He was there. Now, what does that mean? We're going to take it, sort of the assignment underneath all of this. I want you to read the Gospel of John during this time. And I want to point out some things because it might be too easy to read it casually and just read through the words and not really let it talk to you about what it means. Okay? I want you to know, when we get done with the Gospel of John, that this man, while he was unique to all of the followers who followed Jesus, was a very special witness. And what he did and what he wrote down is immensely valuable. Tremendously valuable. None of the rest of the books put that down as their purpose statement. The Gospel of Luke, who also wrote Acts, makes it very clear. He never met Jesus. Luke, who wrote the story of Jesus in his Gospel, never heard a single sermon from Jesus. He came to become a Christian, a follower of Jesus, through the ministry of the Apostle Paul. He did not ever know Jesus in the physical sense. Does that mean we don't believe his gospel? Oh, no. He was a well-educated man, and what he did in researching the story of Jesus and going to Ephesus, the account shows that Mother, the Mary of Jesus, had gone to live in Ephesus. He went and sat down with her and wrote down in detail all the stories of how the angel came and spoke to her and how she went to Elizabeth. Did he see Elizabeth? Did he ever meet Elizabeth? Did he ever meet John the Baptist? No. But he can write a good gospel, though, because he did the research. Matthew, he writes a good gospel. It's wonderful. He's the tax collector that came to be a follower of Jesus, and he followed Jesus for 3 years. He's a great writer for his story of the event of Jesus. But understand, Matthew never says, I saw and I heard every single thing. Does that mean that he's a liar? No. He told us the story of Jesus to the very best of his ability, to the insight that he had. God gave him the message of Jesus. But he never said, I saw and I heard everything. Remember, Matthew goes through and tells the story of the wise men coming, the kings from the east who come and worship Jesus. Was Matthew in that group? No. He told us the truth about what happened, but Matthew never made the claim that he saw the 3 gifts given to Jesus. Matthew tells the story of Jesus going out into the wilderness and being tempted for 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus was absolutely all alone. Did Matthew somehow tag along out there in the wilderness to make sure that Jesus was alone? Didn't have any food or water? No. Matthew never felt like it was a requirement that he had to see and hear and testify to what actually happened in every single situation. So when Jesus came back and said, this is what happened when Satan came and tested me, he could write it down accurately. It's truthful. The same thing happens when Jesus is taken up on what we call the Mount of Transfiguration. We know that Jesus left most of his disciples behind and took Peter, James, and John, the 3, Peter, the rock, James and John, the brothers, the sons of Zebedee, and they went up on top of the mountain and were all by themselves praying when the gates of heaven opened and Moses and Elijah came and took care of Jesus and talked to him and shared with him what was going to happen in Jerusalem. But Matthew tells us the story. Does that mean that Matthew lied to us? No. No. The story of the Transfiguration happens in the Gospel of Matthew. It happens in the Gospel of Mark. It happens in the Gospel of Luke. How many of those men were on that mountain? None of them. It was only Peter, James, and John, and Jesus. But they could tell the story because it happened. It happened. But, you don't find those stories in the Gospel of John. Why? Why? Because John wasn't there. It would ruin his testimony. It would ruin his testimony as the primary personal eyewitness if he told stories in which he was not the witness. He was not there. You see why that's interesting? It was almost like God gave us one writer who could tell the story this way. God gave us another writer who could tell the story this way. And then, just for fun, just so we could be amazed, he gave us a writer who wrote down only what he saw and heard. Okay? That makes my heart leap inside of me. This isn't written 100 years later. This isn't written by some stranger that I really don't even know his name. This is written as a first personal singular pronoun. I saw, I heard, I testify. I wrote it down for you so that you could believe. The Gospel of John is so deep, and it's so rich, and it's so profound, and it's so true. It shakes me all the way to my core every time I study it. It is my core of my belief. Jesus is the core of my belief. But the testimony that brings me the message of Jesus comes through the Gospel of John more powerfully than anything else I can read. So I end up reading John a lot more than anything else because it is my one connection. We talk about only 6 degrees of separation. For the Gospel of John, I can read his words and realize that he's standing right next to Jesus. There is not a moment of separation, not the slightest difference between the two. What happened with Jesus was written by John, and now all these years later, I can read it, and it's like I'm transported directly back in time to stand in the room where Jesus stood and hear the words that Jesus spoke. Now, I'm going to call this lesson complete at this point. This is lesson number 1. And I want you to remember there's a spark plug that's driving John. It is a spark plug that is absolutely the most powerful motivation in the world, so that you can be absolutely convinced that Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of God. That is the power that drives the Gospel of John. Thank you for being a part of this lesson and the beginning of this series. God bless you.